Good morning. So good to see all of you. Thank you again for being here today. Thank you to those of you who have been leading us in our worship today. Jim, for the songs that you've sang, and Chris for reading this passage from Ephesians chapter 4. I want you to keep that passage handy this morning, as we will be going back and forth to that passage several times this morning, studying from Ephesians chapter 4. But it's so good to see all of you, and looking forward to studying with you today. During the month of October, we're talking about preparation for eternity. And we're contemplating the time when tomorrow begins without me. You know, that day is coming. It's coming sooner for some of us and later for others, but Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27 tells us that it's coming. We will die, and then comes the judgment. And living with the conscious reality of this fact really can change our perspective. When we get this and we understand what the Hebrew writer is saying here, it impacts us to the point to where we begin to live for an eternal destination. We begin to live in such a way of a consciousness of the need to build a spiritual legacy. We understand the need to deal with life's priority, because every day we're dwelling inside a relationship with God. With one focus, we're pressing on for the prize. We're so committed that nothing else matters in this life. Everything in the created world is secondary to that which transcends our existence here. When you think about this, how are you doing when it comes to living from an eternal perspective? Let me ask you this morning as we begin our study together. What if you were told that you only had a short time to live? Last week I used the example of what if you were told you had 24 hours to live? How would you spend the rest of this day? But even if you wanted to back that out, how would it change your life if someone with credibility came to you and said, 1 year from today you will die? How would that impact the way you spend the rest of this year and most of next year? Because you know in less than 1 year you're going to be not here, but with the Lord. I believe it would change your life. It would change the way you spend your time. It would change how you reach out and respond to individuals. It would change the way that you say things, and it would change the way that you do things. This month we're trying to come at things from a perspective of what does life look like when you live like you're dying? Last week we talked about the first thing on your priority list would be to deal with life's priority, and that is a relationship with God. Focusing on that one thing, pressing on for the prize that lies ahead. Next week we're going to be talking about if you knew that you only had a short time to live, you would reject complacency, you would reject mediocrity in your life, and you would live life with abundance. You would live life for others. You would live a life of service. The mundane would no longer be something that would be on your mind. And if you knew that you had a short time to live, I believe the Christian would be someone that would approach life from a positive standpoint, because we have been so blessed, and we're going to be so blessed throughout eternity, it can't help but change the perspective of our life. And so this is what we're talking about during the month of October, preparing for eternity and how we do that. Today we're going to zoom in on the second priority, and that is resolving interpersonal conflict. I mentioned this last week as well. Almost all of us have issues inside our families, maybe with some friends and with other people. Issues that really need to be addressed. And I understand that these may be situations that are difficult for us to deal with. They can be awkward and even embarrassing, especially if we've conducted ourselves in an ungodly way in the past and we know it. And we just want to kind of pretend that didn't happen and forget about it, but we know there's still a problem there. But we have to deal with it. Experts tell us that if we knew we were dying, they tell us that this would be one of the first things on our mind. How do I get these interpersonal conflicts resolved? How do I fix the relationships that have gone awry? How do I make things right? How do I forgive someone who has betrayed me, hurt me, or damaged me? How can I forgive a person who has hurt someone I love? These are all things that a person who is living like they're dying is going to be cognizant of and working on to try to resolve in this life. And so as we study together today, we're going to do basically three things. We're going to talk about the Christian is someone who always does the right thing. Then we're going to be talking about what it means to love one another earnestly. And then we're going to wrap up with four very practical suggestions on things you can say to repair those damaged relationships. I understand that you can't control what the other person does or how they react or how they respond to the efforts that you want to make to try to resolve this, but you are always responsible for yourself and how you act and what you try to do in fixing the damaged relationship. That's what we're going to be talking about this morning. On the back page of your bulletin is a short outline. Take that out and let's use it as we go through the lesson. Fill in the blanks, take some notes. Let's get into our study this morning. Let's begin by talking about how the Christian is always someone who does the right thing. And I want to begin with two passages that really are simple and straightforward, especially when it comes to resolving interpersonal conflict. This passage is Romans chapter 12 and verse 18, where the Apostle Paul is writing and he says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Now, I want you to think from the standpoint of the relationships that you have in your marriage, with your family, with your extended family, with your co-workers, with anybody and everybody that you come into contact with. This principle applies. If so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. That is the guiding principle that will really be behind everything else that we talk about today. Everything else we talk about today will be a fulfillment of this and show us what it means to live peaceably with all. Here's another passage. This is the passage that Brother Chris read just a moment ago in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 31. And again, I want you to see the imperative here. The Holy Spirit is writing and says, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and slander be put away with you, along with all malice. So again, as we begin the lesson here, all of these things come out as expectations that are given to us by God Himself. Listen, if there is someone you can't stand to be around, if there is someone that you avoid at all costs, if you sit on one side of the building and exit out the back door so you don't have to go through the entryway to see somebody as you're going out, you are not following this passage. In fact, you may be letting this passage guide you. You're not following the next verse where it says in verse 32, be kind to one another, be tender-hearted, forgive one another, God in Christ forgave you. But if you're harboring resentment, you can't be living up to the expectation of this passage. You are not fulfilling Romans chapter 12 and verse 18 where it says, live in a peaceful manner with all. That's the bottom line. We must always do the right thing. Notice how this point is further proven when we go to Hebrews chapter 12. And I want to look together at verses 14 and 15. Notice again, look at the comparison between Romans 12:18 and the first part of verse 14 of Hebrews 12. Strive for peace with everyone. That sounds a lot like Romans 12:18, doesn't it? Strive for peace for everyone. Then he says, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. Then he goes on and says, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness spring up and cause trouble, and by it many become defiled. You know, here the writer compares bitterness to a root. It's below the surface, hard to see, but notice as you look at verse 14 and 15 here, the effect of that bitterness spreads to those around us as well. It's all-consuming. It has a toxic quality that taints everything around it. That's the message. Wayne A. Grudem in his writing has said, where love is lacking, every word is viewed with suspicion, and every action is liable to misunderstanding, and conflicts abound to Satan's perverse delight. And I know we've all seen situations inside our family where the situation that he describes is just like that. Every word is under scrutiny. Every motive is being judged. Misunderstandings abound, conflict reigns. This describes many marriages. This describes many families. And so if I am perpetuating that, I need to see that and understand that it's a problem. Solomon said the heart knows its own bitterness. You need to ask yourself, what is coming out of my heart? What am I producing? I bear some responsibility here in some of these relationships that may be damaged. Because if your heart is bitter, there's really nothing good that's going to come out of you. What does Jesus say? Out of my heart, the one who believes in me, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. A poisoned spring is not going to bear fresh water. And so all of these passages, as we go through them, explain to us the need to do the right thing, to not allow this attitude to consume us and be in our heart. We've got to fight to eliminate it. We've got to do the right thing here. So that's the first thing that we need to do. Now, we're going to go to 1 Peter for a moment and talk about the need to love one another earnestly. We're going to get to Romans 12:9. That's there on the bottom of your screen. That's at the end of the point. Before we get there, I want to take you to 1 Peter 4. And I want you to look with me, if you will, at verse 7. Because 1 Peter 4, 7 and 8 really should be taken together. And think about this verse, and I'll go ahead and put the blank in, the end of all things is at hand. I want you to think about this verse in the context of what we're talking about this month, preparation for eternity. Think about how 1 Peter 4, 7 applies in preparation for eternity. When Peter says here, the end of all things is at hand, he is talking about a time of consummation and fulfillment. He's talking about our stepping into eternity, either to return with Christ or our own death. And he says the end of all things is at hand. It's imminent. It could happen at any time, he says. Be prepared. There's urgency that's involved here. And notice the second part of verse 7. Since that is true, we need to be maintaining a holy relationship with God. That's characterized by sobriety and seriousness, self-control. A life so pure that our life is characterized by these qualities. Now notice verse 8. He says, above all, keep loving one another earnestly. Just focus on that for a second. Keep loving one another earnestly. That word above all there, that phrase, it's really talking about what is about to come up is of a supreme value, supreme importance, and then he tells us there's really no higher virtue than love. We've got to love one another earnestly. This is the highest thing. It kind of goes along with what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 13 and 13, where he says, now faith, hope, and love abide, but these three, and the greatest of these is love. It goes right on. Peter says, above all, keep loving one another earnestly. Now, earnestly means to be stretched out, extended, as a rope at full tension. It is something that is talking about intensity. It is talking about exertion. And really the love here that Peter is referring to is the sacrificial type love, not the sentimental type love. It is a type of love that endures despite insult or injury or misunderstanding. It is the type of love that should characterize all of my interpersonal relationships. In his writing on this, D.A. Carson has said, the writing that Peter has in mind is the patient forbearance that nips in the bud wrong attitudes and actions. That, if allowed to fester, will attract retaliation, animosity, ultimate dissension, and division. It is the kind of love that does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Think about, it's really a reference to 1 Corinthians 13. But I like what Mr. Carson says here in his commentary. Because many of our relationships do foster retaliation, Words being said, actions happening that we're embarrassed about, dissension, division. How many families have situations where they have another family member they won't even be in the same room with? Carson in his writing goes on to say, this is the love that breaks the downward spiral of wounded sensibilities, hard feelings, nurtured bitterness, dissension, and vendetta. Many of us know from experience what that's like in interpersonal relationships. Peter is saying, love one another earnestly. Do your part in breaking these negative things down. That's what we need to be understanding. And by the way, this is something that's important with Peter. Just rereading 1 Peter, he talks about the love of others quite a bit. Notice, if you will, back in chapter 1, verse 22, love one another earnestly, there it is again, from a pure heart. Then if you go on to chapter 2 and verse 1, put away malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all slander. Then if you go to chapter 3 and verse 9, do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. I need to be asking myself, am I a blessing to others? Am I a blessing by the words that I speak? Am I a blessing by the actions that I engage in? Why do I do this? So that we may obtain a blessing. Our eternity hangs on this. That's what Peter, so here we have all these passages, and we go back to 1 Peter 4, and we look at verse 8 again. Look at the second part of the verse. Keep loving one another earnestly. Why? Since love covers a multitude of sins. What is the message? Love forgives and forgives and forgives. Does that characterize your marriage? Does that characterize the relationship you have with your kids? And on it goes. Think again of 1 Corinthians 13. We alluded to it just a minute ago, but here's the actual passage. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It doesn't insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It doesn't rejoice at wrongdoing, but it rejoices with the truth. And notice verse 7. It bears all things. It believes all things. We think the best of one another, not the worst. That's what he's saying there. It hopes all things, and it endures all things. Sometimes when you love somebody else, you have to put up with a whole lot. But we're called to do that. And let's add to this. Think about how, when we look at this passage, love covers a multitude of sin. This is right in line with a recurring New Testament theme that stresses that evil is overcome by not just by refraining from it, but by doing good. That's what Paul says in Romans 12:21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. This is a recurring message in the New Testament. It's not enough to kill a bad habit. It is essential to love Jesus more. It is not enough to retaliate against an enemy. It is essential to love one's enemy. And the same is true here. We overcome evil by doing good and exhibiting forgiveness. 2 weeks ago, in a Dallas courtroom, the nation saw an incredible display of forgiveness. On September the 6th, 2018, a white Dallas police officer entered into what she thought was her own apartment and shot and killed a black man that she thought was an intruder. The only problem was it wasn't her apartment. Amber Geiger lived in the apartment directly above Botham Jean on the next floor. As the trial went on, September and into October, she admitted on the stand that she shot him to kill him because she thought he was an intruder in her home. The jury unanimously decided that she was guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to 10 years in the Texas penitentiary. Botham Jean's brother, Brant, was asked after the verdict was handed down to provide a victim impact statement at the sentencing hearing. And what happened that afternoon is truly amazing. Maybe you've seen him on the witness stand.
I say, I hope you rot and die, just like my brother did, but I personally want the best for you. And I wasn't gonna ever say this in front of my family or anyone, but I don't even want you to go to jail. I want the best for you. Because I know that's exactly what both of them would want you to do. And the best would be give your life to Christ. I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug, please? Please?
Yes.
The Jean family are members of the Dallas West Church of Christ. This is an incredible testimony of grace, kindness, compassion, and forgiveness. Far beyond, on a level that's far beyond anything that most of us could even imagine. Your brother has been murdered. And he extends forgiveness. He took the lead in that. He took the initiative in that. That's powerful. Here is the forgiveness on a national scale that everybody in the country saw. Many of us face situations that are far less than this. Well, we find it within ourselves to be forgiving. George Mueller, in his writing, has said, "He who fails to forgive others burns the bridge over which he must walk himself." But here is the main point. Here is what Jesus says in His Sermon on the Mount. "For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespass, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." This is the practice, brothers and sisters, of overcoming evil with good. This is loving one another earnestly. So how do we do this? If we're living like we're dying, how do we put this into practice? I mean, we've seen the principles, what we must do. We see what the biblical expectations are on this. Now, how do we put it into practice? What do we do with it? Well, as we begin to wrap up our lesson today, I want to talk about 4 things that we could actually say and verbalize to help improve these relationships. In his book, The 4 Things That Matter Most, Ira Barak speaks of 4 things that matter most to people who are dying. He mentions that when we are dying, suddenly our interpersonal relationships rise to paramount importance. The 4 things in his book can be summarized in this way, saying, "I forgive you," "Please forgive me," "Thank you," and "I love you." Maybe you've had a family member who received news that their life would be coming to an end after a period of days or months, and you saw them put these things into action in the remaining time that they had. Listen, we don't have to wait until we receive that type of news to put the things we're about to talk about into action. And really the point of today's lesson is that we shouldn't wait to the end of life to deal with these things. We should be dealing with them now. So how do we do it? Will we trust God's way? Somebody says, well, you know, there's just no way. There's nothing that could be said. There's nothing that could be done to make this happen. Well, we need to understand that. Healing is always, no matter if there's been years of distance, no matter if there's been years of rejection, we need to understand it's never too late. Any relationship can be fixed and transformed on a permanent basis. And listen, I know some of you are sitting in here today with marriages that are cold and lifeless. Some of you are struggling because of the hurt others have caused you. You've experienced pain and betrayal and rejection. And listen, if we're living like we believe that we're dying, then we're going to see how death has a way of melting those barriers we've erected. Somebody that's hard can become soft and vulnerable. Somebody that's cold can become warm and trusting. You see, the point is that reconciliation is what matters. The joy of reconnection is worth the vulnerability that we risk. You see, grudges erode the joy in our relationships. And we miss so much. There's years that go by. We won't get that time back. Don't die with having left something unsaid. So again, how do we do it? Well, we must practice these words. I forgive you. Nobody's perfect. We all have things that we wish we'd dealt with in a better way. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. How do they want to be treated? I think what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount fits so aptly here. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, you do also to them. If it were you in their shoes, would you want to be forgiven? And the answer is most likely yes. So you be willing to turn it around and say, I forgive you. Notice if we go back to Colossians chapter 3, notice what Jesus doesn't say here as the Lord, or Paul doesn't say here, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive if they have asked for forgiveness. I added that last part on because that's what some people say. Well, I'm not going to forgive them. They haven't asked me for forgiveness yet. That is not what Paul says here. He says we take the initiative. We step out. We take the risk. We trust the Lord. This is what God did for us. Ephesians chapter 5. We've been called to be imitators of God, walk in love as Christ loved us. Did Christ wait to act until we got ourselves right? Not according to verse 2. Jesus gave Himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. He took the initiative. And we're called to take the initiative as well. I forgive you. Then, maybe we say, please forgive me. And again, nobody's perfect, not even yourself. We need a dose of humility. It was Jesus who said, chapter 23 and verse 12, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Listen, in the vast majority of interpersonal conflicts, there is sin on both sides. And let's be honest, keeping score of who sinned the most is just plain childish. It really doesn't matter. You say to yourself, well, they did a whole lot worse than I did. You're both wrong. You both acted unbecomingly. You both marred the image of Christ. If you did something wrong, if you said something wrong, if you embarrassed yourself by foul language or slamming doors or acting out, you need to be willing to take ownership of that and ask for forgiveness. This is the principle of Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 32. Be kind to one another. Be tender-hearted. We don't always act this way in our interpersonal relationships. It doesn't matter if you are right and they're wrong. What matters is, did I reflect Jesus in the best way? And what now would reflect Jesus in the best way? What now would define my walking in love like the Father and the Son? Please forgive me. Then we could say, thank you. Everybody benefits when we express appreciation without restraint. You know, life is short. And we really, really need to learn to appreciate in those around us. And thankfulness, a spirit of thankfulness is what helps us not take life for granted. And that's why Paul says what he does in 1 Thessalonians 5:18, give thanks in all circumstances. That is, generally speaking, I'm a thankful person. Others know it, they see it, they feel it, they understand that's who I am as God's son or daughter. Give thanks in all circumstances. Thank you. And finally, say, I love you. This is kind of personal for me because I don't always do this. And I'm even guilty of doing some of the things I'm about to talk about, to my shame. But it's time that we quit assuming that others know that we love them. I think sometimes we do this. We say, well, they know I love them, and we don't always verbalize that we love them. When you walk out the door tomorrow for work, are you going to tell your wife or your husband that you love them? Is there something that they've done to you that's just irked you, and you've decided you're just going to walk out the door tomorrow morning and you're going to let them know how you really feel by not just saying anything to them? You're going to show them how upset you are. And they're probably going to be spending all day tomorrow thinking, what did I do? What's wrong with him? But what if you don't come home tomorrow night? What then? Bottom line is you and I just have no idea what will happen tomorrow. On Tuesday, September the 11th, 2001, former Navy pilot Brian Sweeney was a passenger on United Airlines 175 that departed Boston Logan, was headed out to San Francisco, and got diverted because the plane got hijacked. And the plane flew from Boston to the south. 3 minutes before the plane impacted with the South Tower of the World Trade Center, retired Navy pilot Brian Sweeney was on board, and he was able to get to the back of the plane, evidently, and call his wife. And here's what he says. Hey, Jules, this is Brian. Listen, I'm on an airplane that's been hijacked, and if things don't go well, they're not looking good, I want you to know that I absolutely love you. I want you to do good. I want you to have good times. The same with my parents. I'll see you when you get here. I want you to know that I totally love you. Bye, baby. Hope I'll call you. 3 minutes later, Brian Sweeney is dead. When we have the proper grasp, brothers and sisters, on the temporal quality of life, it's going to change the way that we impact others in our relationships. Some of the issues, listen, that we fight amongst ourselves in our relationships are just amazingly insignificant. We get upset at each other over donuts. Or something even less significant than that. It's just really selfish. The easiest way to address all of this is by focusing on the other person and letting them know how much you love them. Love covers a multitude of sins. This is why Paul says what he does. Let your love be genuine. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. So what about you? Are you living like you're dying? Are you living with eternity in mind? Have you dealt with life's priority? Are you resolving interpersonal relationships? Are you committed to following this passage? This is the foundation behind everything that we've talked about this morning. If so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. That is the undergirding for every relationship I have in this life. My marriage, my kids, my family, my grandparents, my grandkids, my coworkers, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, whoever it is, this passage dictates my life. Live peaceably with all. Does that describe you? If not, there's no time like the present to get your life right. I hope today's lesson has challenged you as it has me. If in some way that you need to ask publicly for God's help, this invitation is for you. We will pray with you and encourage you. There's no family like the Kettering family to be encouraging and get behind you. If you're with us today and you haven't dealt with life's priority of maintaining and building and getting that relationship with God where it needs to be, this invitation is for you. We want you to leave here with assurance of your salvation, prepared for eternity. Can we help you do that this morning? All things are ready. Why don't you come forward as we stand and sing?